So thanks to everyone for taking the time to take a look at this presentation. I'm going to be talking today about a couple of different LP-DAAC products that I use in my research, specifically to explore arid land plant water balance. And mostly I've been using EcoStress, but with the development of APPEARS, I've also been using other types of LP-DAAC data. And so for a little bit of context, we all know that water is the lifeblood of the desert, and plant and water balance is a critical factor determining the abundance and distribution of vegetation across landscapes. And that vegetation also supports diverse wildlife habitats, and the availability of water is really critical for supporting both plants and animals across dryland ecosystems. But we know that in the southwestern United States, climate change is really increasing not only the aerial distribution of droughts, right, where many parts of the western United States in summer are experiencing exceptional drought, but also the frequency and the duration of droughts across the southwestern United States. And so this really threatens water supply in these already very arid landscapes. And we know that arid land plants are also struggling to survive and grow in this hotter, drier climate. And so what we see on the left is a time series of tree mortality using remotely sensed imagery from 2014 to 2018. And we can see increases in the numbers of dead trees per acre, but also what we can see in that is that the lower elevations, where it's the hottest and driest, are the areas that are experiencing the highest tree mortality. And of course, that has to do with increases in evaporative demand and increasing pressure deficits that increase drying in the leaf and making it more difficult for plants to grow in this hotter, drier climate. Seedlings are no exception to this rule, and this is a great title for a New York Times article that came out in March this year, mapping California's zombie forests, where we can see that there's a climatic mismatch between the adult tree species that regenerated 100 to 200 years ago under cooler, wetter climates and the local environment where trees are regenerating today. So this, coupled with increasing disturbance frequencies, like increasing severity in wildfires and numbers of acres burned under climate change, is also threatening the capacity of plants to survive and grow in this environment. And so this creates this sort of double whammy effect of fire and climate change on plant survival. And so what we can see in the left panel is that things like vapor pressure deficit, or the drying capacity of air, temperature, drought, wildfire, those have all increased from the past to the present and are all predicted to increase even more in the future. And so what that is doing is it's at the same, so both drought and disturbances are increasing mortality of trees and decreasing recruitment or growth of these forests. And so this is a real problem because our forests in dryland systems are really critical ecosystem service provisioners. And so this jeopardizes the capacity of these arid land plant communities to provide these really critical ecosystem services to humanity and wildlife. And so my lab is integrating field measurements, the EcoStress data, other remotely sensed imagery to answer sort of two overarching questions. One is, how do arid land plant communities differ in their plant water status under different levels of natural anthropogenic disturbance? And then secondly, asking the question of how vegetation restoration influences the fire and drought resilience of arid land plant communities. So these are kind of the two broad research questions that my lab is addressing right now. And today, I'm going to talk about how we're using EcoStress imagery in arid land habitats to understand drivers of plant water stress across the Southwest. And then we're analyzing the performance of EcoStress for characterizing plant hydrology and vegetation dynamics, right? So this is a new type of imagery, not a lot of validation, or a lot of application. And so we're using EcoStress for a lot of different things to try to figure out where it works and where it doesn't work. And so to start off, I'm going to just give you an overview of a few projects that we're working on. And so first of all, this is a paper that was published in 2021, but basically what we were looking at is how fire severity and vegetation recovery after fire drive evapotranspiration in a pine oak forest in the southeastern Arizona. And what we see is that there's been this transition that's occurred over time and due to these large contemporary wildfires that we're experiencing. And so we're seeing some sites that are fairly intact after fires that are burned at low severity, but other sites that have converted to high severity shrublands after fire. And so this is a real concern, sort of looking at these transitions. And we don't really know much about what the post-fire water balance is like in these areas that have burned at different fire severities. And then we have also fires that have burned through a dry site specialist forest type pinyon scrub. And so what we found is that on the right-hand side, you can sort of see that DNVR on the x-axis, which is fire severity or the amount of vegetation killed by a fire, is a significant predictor of post-fire evapotranspiration. And we also see that oaks that have regenerated after high-severity wildfire in this transition from pine oak forest to oak shrublands cycle a lot more water, significantly more water than the intact forest before. The higher the fire severity, the higher the evapotranspiration. So these shrublands, the higher the severity, the more ET, or the higher the ET. And that actually has a lot to do with the rapid recovery of shrublands, creating this continuous forest canopy or shrubland canopy with high ET. So this is really good for shrublands, but it could really lead to a lot of excessive soil drying across the landscape if we have these big conversions from intact pine oak forest to oak shrublands that are dominating the post-fire landscape. We also see that they transpire more water for more hours per day than forests. So the precessing orbit of the ecostress satellite offers the opportunity for us to look at how evapotranspiration might vary in different times of day. And we can see that these areas in shrublands actually have higher transpiration midday, meaning that they're quite drought tolerant, right? And so this explains this pattern of post-fire vigor that we see in shrublands in the wake of high severity fire. And this is also different than a lot of other higher fire severity sites because we have this rapid recovery of vegetation after the fire, right? Many sites remain depressed for years to decades in ET after fire because there's simply no leaf area present. So that's one study that we published. That was sort of the first ecostress study. Now I'm going to talk about Jenna Oteola, my thesis student's project, where we're looking at topahydrological influences on wildfire severity in 53 different wildfires across the state of Arizona, across a range of different vegetation types. So not just forest, but across these desert scrublands as well that you see in this image. And so we're asking this question of what drives fire severity, right? So we have land fire data from the Geospatial Data Clearinghouse there for topography. We also have daymet data from appears, precipitation, solar radiation, vapor pressure. And then we have more land fire data about fire regimes. And then we have ecostress data, right? Evapotranspiration or plant drought stress data. And so what you're seeing in the center here is the fire behavior triangle. And so essentially the behavior of fire, or the severity, is going to be the fire behavior metric that I'm going to talk about, right? The amount of vegetation that was killed by the fire is really based on the weather conditions, the topography, and then the amount, arrangement, and moisture of fuels. And so these different remotely sensed variables for the different fire locations can tell us a lot about what drives fire severity, right? And so fire severity was measured using Landsat. Fire severity data are relativized difference normalized burn ratio data, and that is also available at the MTBS website. So I used all these geospatial data clearinghouses to try to put together this model of predictor variables and then outcomes of fire severity. So we did this at 1,000 random points, 58 fires, and on cloud-free imagery. And so surprisingly, although the media talks about all these high severity fires that are burning across the landscape in recent years, in 2019 and 2020, and 2019 was quite a drought year, as was 2020, we see that most of these fires are still burning, or most of the area of the landscapes that burned in 2019 and 2020 in Arizona are burning at low severity. So that's really interesting. Low severity fire is really still a component of how these forests burn. And then we built a random forest model using these different remotely sensed data to try to predict what was driving fire severity across these two different fire years. And so you can see that evapotranspiration does show up as a significant predictor variable. So ecostress is a significant variable. But the next thing that we're doing now is using the Google Earth Engine Landsat image library to pull normalized difference wetness and normalized difference moisture index data from Landsat to see if there's any difference in how it performs as a predictor variable of fire severity. We're also using ecostress to look at drought stress in treated forest stands, places that have been restored. So what we see here is the Stanislaus National Forest, where we have these different treatment blocks that are thinned, burned, or thinned and burned, or control. And then the question sort of is how forest management influences post-treatment drought stress. And so we have this long-term field study with permanent plots, and then we intersected those data with ecostress, land surface temperature, and ET data, and then also Landsat and EWI from Google Earth Engine. And so what we see here is this pattern, right? So there actually wasn't a big drought in 2019. The drought started to come on in 2020. Peak drought in August 2021, and continued drought then in August 2022. So what you're looking at here is sort of the time series of when we have ecostress data available, right? But we really didn't have a lot of really good quality ecostress data for that no drought period, which is really unfortunate, because so it kind of hindered our ability to look at drought versus no drought plant water status, right, or water cycling. And so what we see is the LST, picks up that signal of land surface temperature increasing during peak drought, but it doesn't look at it doesn't really detect any treatment differences, despite really visible differences in the aerial imagery in terms of vegetation density. And then we also see, the depressed ET at drought onset, but we don't see, again, very many differences in the treatment data. And now if we move on to the NDWI data, what we see is treatment differences, but NDWI at 30-meter resolution, or the normalized difference wetness index from Landsat, is still not really picking up some of these differences, despite the fact that we have a lot of field data to show that these thinned or treated stands experience significantly lower mortality in drought years after treatment than these other sites that were untreated. And so our next step is to actually go ahead and use Sentinel-2 data to see how it also compares. And so now I'm going to continue the talk to sort of talk about how ecostress performs for characterizing arid land plant hydrology and vegetation dynamics. And so this question of is ET a good predictor of post-fire pine regeneration? So again, we used plot data and from vegetation surveys from before, after, and then 10 years after fire. So this is a repeated measures plot data set. And in the past, what we did was we looked at the effects of fire severity and topography on pine regeneration. And then now in our most recent survey, we were interested to see if NDVI or ecostress evapotranspiration data could help us or improve our ability to predict pine regeneration in the post-fire landscape in southeastern Arizona. And so what we see is that using Mars regression modeling, we see that elevation, TRMI, and NDVI from Landsat add explanatory value, but we don't see significant model improvement when we add ecostress data. And so why might that be? I think we're working, as you can see in the top left, in really topographically dissected landscapes. And so I think that 70-meter resolution pixel might be testing the limits of its performance in terms of characterizing pine regeneration that happens at a fairly small scale. And then lastly, I just want to talk about one more project that we're doing. Is sort of looking at whether ecostress can detect differences in native versus invasive riparian plant evapotranspiration along the Rio Grande along the Texas-Mexico border. And so large areas of the Big Bend reach of the Rio Grande have been invaded by giant cane. And so what you see on the left is a stretch of river that has native vegetation. And then on the right, you can see massive stands of Arundodonax that have come in, and it really changes the sedimentation and the hydrology of the river. And so here's the natives, and here's giant cane. And what we see is that although there's extensive literature suggesting that native vegetation, it has significantly lower evapotranspiration than giant cane, which lots of empirical studies showing that it sucks water up and dries soils a lot and has really high ET. We don't see that in the ecostress imagery. And so that was really kind of surprising for us. And I think it has a lot to do with these mixed pixels. So here's an example of the footprint of an ecostress pixel. And what we can see is that there's a lot going on in this single pixel, right? A lot of mixed vegetation and even areas that have no vegetation at all. And I think that that's a factor that's influencing this signal. And so in conclusion, ecostress is really promising for these different kinds of applications, but it might have some limitations in these heterogeneous environments where vegetation or topography or rivers move right through a pixel, right? So we have a lot of changes over short geographical distances, and that I think could really sort of challenge the capacity of ecostress to be able to predict evapotranspiration within these areas. And so, I think more validation across a range of vegetation types, the STARS algorithm that's up may also perform better. So that's another thing we're starting to do, is make some comparisons between collection 1 and collection 2. And, obviously data fusion techniques might also improve its performance. So with that, I want to thank you all. We do a lot of field work. We get out there, we measure a lot of trees, and try to intersect that with remotely sensed imagery to understand relationships between plot scale processes and landscape scale processes. So thanks so much for listening, and I appreciate your time.